Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Amanda for joining us. We're really excited to learn more about pasture management, and I'm going to mute myself so she can get started.
All right, sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining and thanks for having me. Excited to join you guys to talk about one of the my most favorite topics, which is kind of an overview of all things related to pasture management. So with that, I'm gonna kind of dive right into it. So you probably all have seen pastures that looked like something like this before, right? Where we have forages that are present kind of across the field, but not necessarily like super lush or super productive. And it can be a fairly quick turnaround from something that looks like this to something that looks a little bit more like this, right? So it's easy to let our pasture management kind of get away from us. So what we're going to talk about tonight is how to avoid this type of situation from happening. So, one of the most common questions that I get as a forage specialist is, what should I plant? And that's a hard question to answer because there's a lot of different backstory questions kind of that go into that, and we'll touch on a little bit of that tonight. But one of the main things that I want to point out and I want to kind of bring focus on a little bit tonight is that there's no forage species that's going to persist if it's continuously overgrazed or we're not using good grazing management practices, right? So that has to come first, it has to be the foundation of it, and then we can be more selective about forage species and things like that from there. So, good pasture can offer a lot of advantages, right? Good pasture management will maintain the integrity of our pasture, improve the longevity of our stand, decrease things like soil erosion, increase the forage quality maybe in our pasture. But essentially, the point here is that good pasture really requires good management. So we can't have a good productive pasture system without having that management that underlays that. So I kind of was thinking about like the best way to kind of set this up, and I don't know if you guys, well, I think everyone's familiar with like the 3 or 4 R's for recycling, right? Like reduce, reuse, recycle. If you're familiar at all with nutrient management, which you may or may not be, they have the 4 R's for nutrient management for right place and right time and right amount of fertilizer applied. So I was like, well, we need some R's for grazing management. So what we're going to talk about is the 4 R's for grazing management. Anyone have any guesses what those R's might include? You can feel free to pop them in the chat if you want. Um, we're going to start with the basics, right? Start with what's beneath our feet, if you will. That might give you a little bit of a hint about the first R. So we're starting with the roots. So we know that the roots are the foundation for a good pasture system, and we need to work on building our soil fertility or soil health to be able to support our good pasture production. So we're going to start with there. As you know, fellow animal enthusiasts, we like to look at the animals, right? We like to see how they're doing, how healthy they are, what they're eating, how they're doing out in the field. But as a forage person, I now oftentimes look a lot at what they're eating, right? We all know that what we eat is really essential for optimum performance or optimum health. And so we may look at the forages, but we're going to take that one more step further and look at what's supporting those forages that are supporting our horses. Hopefully that makes sense. So healthy pastures really start with a healthy foundation, and that comes from a healthy soil system to support those. So adequate soil fertility is really essential. It plays a very critical role in forage systems. We need it for good forage establishment. We need it for good root growth. We need it for nutrient uptake, forage yield, weed pressure, the stand vigor over time, all kinds of things that we can get from good forage persistence. So this is just to kind of illustrate that point, if you will. This is two images taken side by side in a field. If you look actually in the background back here, you can see this picture, right? So side by side strips in the same field. And the only difference between these two pictures was that they took soil samples from this field, and in the strip on the right, they applied nutrients based on what their soil test results were, and in the strip on the left, they didn't apply anything. And you can very clearly see this was a new seeding. You can very clearly see the difference in forage establishment from having that base level of underlying nutrients present in the soil. So we always think about how, we need optimum protein and energy and vitamins and minerals in our animals' ration to support, the performance or the growth that we want to see. And we can say the same thing about our forages. We need optimal nutrition in the soil to support our forage production. So when we think about the nutrient cycle in terms of forages, we have a series of inputs and outputs. On the input side, we have things like the natural mineralization process that's happening in the soil. We have fertilizer, things we might be adding into that nutrient system. We have manure, we have feed or minerals that we may be feeding on the pasture that can contribute some nutrients. If we have legumes like clover or alfalfa in our system, that can be an added source of nutrients. On the output side, we have things like harvesting or removing forage, that removes nutrients from the system. We have livestock or their products that are, grown and then removed from that system essentially. And we have some loss pathways that, of course, we try to minimize, but can also be a source of losses of nutrients as well. What happens though, all too often, is that these get a little bit out of whack and our outputs start to outweigh our inputs. And essentially, this means we're basically mining that soil for nutrients. And so we're not going to be able to sustain long-term productivity if we are essentially mining that soil over time. So we always recommend that we start with what we have. So we want to look at a soil test, and I'll talk about kind of the steps involved in that here in a second. But this will help us quantify what nutrients are present in our soil, give us some baseline data. We can start to identify what things are lacking or more deficient, what things are adequate. And this is just a list of a lot of the essential or all of the essential forage nutrients. You'll recognize a lot of them are very similar for essential nutrients for rations and diets for us and our horses. And we have some macronutrients that are required in higher quantities, and we have some micronutrients that are required in much smaller quantities. So when it comes to taking a soil sample, just for anybody who's not familiar or who has never taken a sample before, there's a few keys. We want to get a good quality sample, right? So normally we want to divide our total kind of pasture area up into different zones. If you only have a few acres of pasture, you can probably get away with just one zone, right? But if you have a lot of acres of pasture, you might want to divide those up into like a hilly pasture versus a flat land versus something that stays really wet, or if you have really different soil types, you could sample those separately, etc. Um, we want to basically walk through our entire field and take a bunch of soil cores using a soil probe, which is what you see here. Where my hand is in that photo is a little foot peg to step on, and you push that down into the soil surface, and it comes out with this nice little soil core so that you don't have to dig big holes across your field. And we want to take at least 15 to 20 or even more, depending on the size of the field, cores throughout that field. We want to avoid sampling like right where the hay was fed, right where the water is, right, immediately next to the gate probably. If there's trees where animals congregate under, we kind of want to avoid those hot spots, if you will, because they're likely to have a much higher concentration of nutrients in those spots compared to kind of the field as a total. And the reason we say we want 15 to 20 cores, so this is just an example showing nitrogen, for example. And then as you move to the right on that image, the number of samples gets higher and our variability gets lower, right? So if we were to just take a few cores, we might get one that was super low. We might get one that was on the high end. But what we want is to get further out and have that average kind of level out a little bit. So that's where that kind of 15 to 20 or maybe even more, depending on the size, cores comes together. So we're going to mix all those up in a bucket and take a composite from that, and then that's what we're going to be able to submit to the lab for our soil sample. So we're not going to have time to talk about all the different things on a soil test. I'll show you an example of what a soil test looks like here in a second. But I wanted to touch on a few really key or important things. So the first is thinking about soil pH. This is not necessarily like a nutrient that we need to provide to our forages, but the pH of the soil is going to affect basically everything else that happens in that soil. So in this figure, you can see a range of soil pH or soil acidity moving from a more acidic sample on the left over to a more alkaline sample on the right. Remember, for pH, 7 is neutral, right? So that 7.0 in the middle there would be a neutral soil. And the black bars with the different nutrients that you see here represent availability of those nutrients at different pHs. So you can see that as we get more acidic, as we move more to the left of that figure, some of our key nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium become skinnier. So they become less available as our soil gets more acidic. At the same time, other nutrients, things like aluminum, iron, copper, those become more available and we can potentially have some potential for toxicity. Think like aluminum toxicity is something that can occur in forages. So we want to ideally maintain our pH for most forages in that 6 to 7 range. So not totally neutral, but like just shy of neutral is kind of the optimum range for a lot of our forage species. And we see a lot of soil samples here in Maryland, and I'm sure in other areas as well, that are a little bit more on the acidic end of that. The other thing we want to look at pH, or the other reason we want to look at pH for, is not only does it affect nutrient availability, but it also can affect root growth and development. So again, here you can see some images with soil with plants that are grown on soils with different levels of pH. The one on the left is at 6.5. So remember we said 6 to 7 is kind of the ideal. So you can see how much more root growth, there's more root hairs, the roots are longer, they're going deeper into the soil at that more ideal pH versus the two on the right are in more acidic soils, which with a lower pH, and they have a lot shallower, less developed root systems. So especially for doing a new planting, but really at all times of the year, we want to make sure that we're keeping that pH where it needs to be, so we're allowing those root systems to get them as much as they can in terms of nutrients and water from the soil, reaching far down into that soil profile, and being able to extract the maximum amount of water and nutrients from the soil. So I know this is a little bit small and we're not going to have time to talk about everything, but I wanted to show really quickly an example of what a soil sample would look like. And so here we have, these are two different samples. So you can see we have, two different names of two different pastures. These were taken from the research center that I'm based at a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago, I think, just to use as an example. There's the pH that I was talking about. So you can see in this case we have 6.3 and 6.6. So our pH is within that kind of 6 to 7 range that we want to see it at. We also have things like organic matter that we can look at, which is one thing people like to look at over long periods of time. It takes a long time to increase organic matter percentages, especially depending on, your soil type and your management practices and all different kinds of things. But ideally, we want to see that organic matter increasing over time, building organic matter in the soil. As we move over to the right further, we can see some of those amounts that are present in these soils for macronutrients. So phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, those are some of the macronutrients. And we can also see some of the micronutrients there. So like sulfur and zinc and copper, things like that are those nutrients that are required in much smaller quantities. And then the kind of um, call to action or thing we're going to look at to determine what to actually do about the soil sample is going to be the recommendations. And so you can see here for each of those two fields, they have listed out the recommendations in terms of what they suggest you apply to these fields in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and some of the other minerals as well. And I just wanted to highlight one important thing. When you're submitting a soil sample, it's really important to put an accurate description of what crop you're going to grow in that field. So is this a grass pasture? Is it a mixed species pasture? Is it a new seeding or not? Is it an established field already? Is it a cover crop or whatever it might be? That will affect this recommendations that you get back from the lab. So we really want to make sure we're putting an accurate description of what we're going to plan to be growing in that field, so that the recommendations can align most closely with what those plants are going to need. So uh, that kind of gives us a baseline level of fertility, right? And so we can add fertility to our forage systems with fertilizer, right? We can, purchase commercial fertilizer. We can spread that out on our pastures. We can also use other things that can be sources of fertility. So manure is a good source of fertility, right? Especially some of the micronutrients. So manure could be spread on the field or compost, or through grazing, or if it was like stockpiled or composted from a barn and then spread on the field. Either way, that is a source of nutrients or fertility for the field. Hay feeding, if we are feeding hay on a pasture and not in like a dry lot or some sort of confined area in a barn or a stall or whatever, if we're feeding it on the pasture, that can actually be a source of nutrients for that field. And other things, there are other things besides this list, but just wanted to kind of highlight a few. If we have legumes growing in a field, so if we have clovers or alfalfa or other things in the mix, those are capable of fixing nitrogen. So that can be another source of fertility for our forage systems and can reduce the amount of nitrogen that we need to supply for maximum production. So a lot of different options in terms of fertility, in addition to just using commercial fertilizer. The other thing I wanted to mention is the soil tests and the kind of evaluation from that focus a lot on the chemical side of soil, right? So they're focusing on what nutrients are there, what nutrients are lacking, how can we make those up, which is very important. But we also have other components of our soil as well. We have the physical components like our soil structure, water holding capacity, things like that. Some of those we can't change, right? We can't necessarily change the soil type that we have, but we can work to like build organic matter, which helps with water holding capacity, things like that. And then we also have the biological components of the soil. And I just wanted to mention this to get you thinking a little bit about ways to address soil fertility, not only in terms of the chemical nutrients that we need, but also in terms of helping the soil biology as well. So this is an example. I apologize. It's a beef cow example, but example from a colleague over in West Virginia where they calculated essentially the biomass of all organisms above ground in a pasture versus below ground in a pasture. And so if we look at above ground was the cows that were there, the forage or grasses that were growing in that field, and we total those up versus everything below ground, the roots, the bacteria, the fungi, the earthworms, everything else that was kind of below the soil surface. There's actually like a huge amount of life down there that we don't often or always think about. So we want to be thinking about the below ground life in terms of our pasture management because that's going to help our plants grow and succeed and maintain their productivity over kind of the long term, like long term health. So we're not going to talk about all of these, but these are kind of the soil health principles. I don't know if anyone has heard of them before, but the different soil health principles that we can use to kind of boost our grazing systems. So minimizing disturbance, maximizing the coverage of that soil, integrating livestock by grazing, keeping living roots in the soil system, increasing diversity. Those are all things we can do to build soil health and help build that biological component of the soil. So that was kind of an overview of adequate soil fertility and working on building soil health, thinking about the roots, the first of our four R's. Next, we're going to move to the second R, which is rotation. You may have guessed that was one of the R's. But we're going to utilize rotational grazing to move animals across the different fields. And we'll talk about kind of how to set that up, how to think about it. So there's a whole bunch of different grazing systems we can use, right? These are not the only ones. There's tens of other ones as well that you may see, terminology floating around on the internet or on other things that you may read. But essentially, if we think about kind of an a sliding scale, if you will, where on the left-hand side we have no rotation at all, or what we call a continuous grazing system. Basically, animals have access to the whole field. They can go around and select whatever they like. This oftentimes leads to lower forage utilization. And what I mean by that is they're not using all of the forage that's available to them. Some of it they're letting grow up and become more mature and more stemmy. Other areas, they may be repeatedly going back and kind of overgrazing those areas. So overall, that lowers the total utilization of a field and has some detrimental effects in terms of plant regrowth and things like that, which we'll talk about. So if we look at that kind of continuous system, we're looking at maybe only 30 or 40% utilization of the forages in that field. If we shift from that to more of a rotational system, regardless of if it's more of a simple system with a slow, maybe you move them every 3, 5, 7 days, or if you get really intensive and you move animals every few days. What we're doing essentially in either of these is controlling the amount of time our animals are spending in a given area and allowing other areas to recover. And so what this does is we get a higher utilization of the forages in that field because we're kind of making animals move around and utilize areas of the field where they may not have gone otherwise. And it allows for more even grazing, more even manure distribution, less parasite problems if you have anything like that. So we can really increase the amount of forage in a field we're able to utilize by implementing some sort of rotational grazing system. So I mentioned that, animals have strong preferences. I think horses are one of the species that are most guilty of that. And their preference often results in a lot of variability across the field, right? We have areas that are really overgrazed. We have other areas that are really underutilized. So we can use some mowing or clipping to kind of help even out that forage differential across the field. But we can also use our rotational grazing to start to even out that grazing pressure. So in this field that you see in the picture, maybe we go and set up a temporary or semi-temporary fence line or subdivide that field somehow, kind of force the animals to stay off of those areas where they're really kind of overgrazing it and kind of eliminating those forages almost and use more of the areas that they've kind of been leaving. So that's the goal behind a rotational system. I mentioned that it also affects manure distribution across a field. So we said earlier that manure could be a good source of nutrients. And one of the things that manure has an advantage in over commercial fertilizers is it's a good source of a lot of those micronutrients. So manure has a lot of those good micronutrients in it. And so we want to be able to use that to as an advantage, right? And have that boost our fertility in our grazing systems. But one of the things we need to think about is how uniformly those nutrients are distributed across a pasture. So, we may have seen uh, fields that look like this, where we have these really bright green clumps of forage amongst kind of other like smaller growing forages. And this is usually a pretty clear indication that there might be some nutrient lacking from that field, and that's why right where those manure or urine spots were deposited, we have a lush forage growth where those extra nutrients were deposited. And we know that animals tend to congregate, right? Whether that's at a shade source, around a water trough, might be by the gate, in their favorite spot in the pasture, whatever it is, they tend to congregate, and wherever they hang out, that's where they're depositing those nutrients, right? So they actually did a really interesting study in Missouri where they looked at how does grazing management affect manure distribution or nutrient distribution. And essentially they found that in a continuous system, so no rotation at all, it took 27 years to get one manure pile per square yard. So really uneven distribution of manure across a field, right? We're depositing a lot of nutrients from throughout the field in the areas where those animals are congregating as they go out and graze and then come back and hang out in their preferred spot. But if we are implementing more of a rotation, moving those animals around that field, we can really reduce that and we can get a much more even distribution of nutrients across the field. The other thing that we can also use to our advantage, kind of a similar concept, is hay feeding. So I know a lot of times horses are fed hay in their stalls, overnight or in like dry lots or small paddocks. But if we are feeding hay ever out on a pasture, we can think about, again, how uniformly are we depositing nutrients around a pasture, both in terms of manure from the animals and also that hay itself that is wasted and like stomped into the ground a little bit can be another source of nutrients for our system. So this was an example from a research station down in North Carolina. It was a beef cattle lab. They were feeding animals on this pasture hay through the winter months, and the orange circles represent some grid sampling that they did for soil phosphorus levels. So anywhere you see a really large orange circle, that's where they had a really high concentration of soil phosphorus. And anywhere you see a really small orange circle, that's where they had a really low concentration of soil phosphorus. So you can probably guess fairly easily where like hay was being fed in this system, right? Makes sense. It's probably right inside the gate, probably easy access from where the hay was stored, easy to get in and out of the field during the winter months. But essentially, what they did was deposited a lot of nutrients in those spots. And so, as much as we can be thinking about this, we can do things like feeding hay on our poorest pastures or fields where we have the lowest amount of nutrients. We can move those feeding spots around within reason, right? As much as feasibly possible. Moving those feeding spots around, feeding those hay where nutrients are lacking is going to help make up for that nutrient deficiency in those areas and add some extra fertility and organic matter in those spots. So just something to think about if you're feeding hay out in your pastures at all, that is a source of nutrients that we can use to our advantage. All right, so with rotational grazing, one of the like most common questions that we get asked is like, well, how do I know when to start grazing, when to stop grazing, when to move animals to the next field? Well, when it comes to forages, we have this balancing act between quality and yield. So as forages are growing, they're increasing in size, they're increasing in the stem content, and we get a higher yield. But this comes at the expense of quality. So we want to try to find that sweet spot or that balancing act, ideally, between quality and yield. So when forages are vegetative and really leafy and they look like this, there's no seed heads on them. There's more leaf concentration there, there's more energy, there's more protein, there's more vitamins and minerals there, versus when they start to get more stemmy, they start to have a seed head on them, they go to seed. Those are more mature, they're going to have higher proportion of stems, more fiber, and less energy or less overall forage quality. And so we're balancing a high quality, low yield with a low quality, high yield and trying to find that sweet spot between those. So what does that sweet spot look like? So this is just a table that was put together by a bunch of different colleagues that were looking at across a bunch of different forage species, what would be the optimum height for starting grazing and ending grazing? And I'll pull out kind of some of the main ones. So orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, all common cool season grasses for those that are in kind of, the transition zone or the northern half of the country. Very common grasses that we find in pastures and hayfields across the area. And so you can see these are all kind of in that like, 8 to 12-inch range on average for kind of the recommendation for starting grazing. Um, so obviously you can go out and measure that, right? We can go out with a grazing stick, we can use a ruler, whatever we might want to use to measure the height if we're not sure. I also like to tell people just as a good visual, a lot of like water bottles or coffee cups or, those kinds of things. Unless you have the super size Stanleys or whatever. A lot of those like water bottles are probably in that like 8-10 inch range, right? So if you set your water bottle down upright in the field and the grass is taller than that, probably a good indication that you're ready to start grazing. Now, those are more of the cool season forages. It differs maybe a little bit for anyone who's maybe further south. If you're having a lot more Bermuda grass pastures or things like that, that might be a slightly different target height. But hopefully, this chart will give you like a good starting point for when to be looking at for starting grazing and knowing when forages are ready to be grazed. So that is a rotation. The next one goes like really closely hand in hand. Well, they all go together, but the next one goes really closely hand in hand with rotation. And it's what happens when we rotate, which is basically rest, right? So we're allowing for a rest period between grazing events, and we're accomplishing that through our rotation. And I just wanted to touch on this one briefly to talk about kind of why that rest period is so important. So in a continuously grazed system, so with no rotation at all, most plants are can be grazed actually as often as every 2 to 7 days. So animals are continuously going back to those same areas that they prefer and regrazing those plants again and again. And this is detrimental because it eventually will deplete the reserves of those plants. And so this is just for illustration's sake, some screenshots from a video that I really like that the University of Kentucky put out. And they basically took some orchard grass plants and they grew them in the greenhouse. And the pot on the left, they were simulating a continuous grazing system. So every week they went and clipped that pot down to a 1 inch cutting height to simulate that kind of repeated grazing back to back. The pot on the right was right next to it, obviously, but instead they clipped that one to follow more of a rotational grazing system. So they clipped it once a month down to a 3.5 inch height. So kind of the difference between a continuous and like a good rotational system. This picture is showing the after repeatedly doing this a bunch of times, what it looked like the day that they cut it, and this was only 6 days later. So a huge difference in terms of the amount of forage produced by those plants, right, under those different systems. And I realize that this is only a greenhouse example, but the same kinds of things are happening out in our fields, right? Plants that are really healthy, that have had that good rest period, are going to be able to regrow a lot faster and be a lot more productive kind of long term than ones that are stressed and are just kind of barely trying to survive. We also know that what happens above ground is relatively reflective of what's happening below the soil surface as well. So, proper rest is going to allow those plants to handle stressors, and it's also going to help the roots as well. So, this is a similar type of kind of picture. On the left, there's a plant that was cut to 2 inches every week. The one in the middle was cut to 2 inches every 2 weeks, and the one on the right was cut to 2 inches every 4 weeks, so longer rest period. And you can see not only more above ground growth as you get a longer rest period, but also more root growth and root biomass underneath the soil surface as well. So that plant, of course, is going to be a lot healthier, a lot more able to handle stresses like drought or, disease, insect pressure, grazing, whatever those stressors might be. So we, like I said, accomplished the rest period by using rotational grazing. Options we can use if pastures are too wet or they're not ready to be grazed again, we can use a sacrifice area. This could be like a little dry lot like you see there. It could be just one pasture that we decide to sacrifice to preserve the rest of our pastures in our system. And as far as timing, the amount of time we want to leave animals in each pasture is going to depend on the weather and the time of year. We want to go by the forage growth, not by the calendar. So we don't want to say just the whole entire year we're going to, move them to the next pasture once a week and, they have 3 weeks off and then they're back, right? We want to go by the forage growth, and if those forages have regrown to an adequate height and have that adequate rest period and are ready to be regrazed again. So when we're thinking about how to set up a pasture system, there's a few things obviously to consider. Keeping this kind of rest and rotation in mind, we want to think about how we want to manage this. So I said there's a whole spectrum, right, between more of a simple rotation where we have a few pastures that we're rotating between to, this can get very complicated very quickly, right? With a lot of really intensive moves. Most people probably are going to fall somewhere in the middle, right? We have to think about where on that scale we want to fall. That will help determine our paddock sizing. So the faster we're going to rotate, the smaller the paddocks are going to be. The slower we're going to rotate, the larger those paddocks are going to be. Will also help us determine the number, right? People ask all the time, well, how many paddocks should I have, right? What's a good number? That's really hard to answer because it's unique to every situation, right? But I will say that any number is going to be better than one, right? If you go from one pasture to two pastures that you're rotating between, you're providing some rest where before there was no rest, right? Oftentimes, as kind of a really rough rule of thumb, I've heard 5 to 10 or 8 to 10 paddocks for kind of minimizing overgrazing and starting to provide more of that proper rest period. So that might be a place to start, but you're going to have to kind of figure it out, play around with some different options. Call in people to come help. We're happy to help if you need some help with that. Paddock shape and layout is another consideration. Now, obviously, those two examples there are showing a perfectly square box, right? But in reality, most of our pastures are much more complicated systems with roads and driveways and trees and different gates in different places and, all kinds of different obstacles to like design them around. So if you haven't ever before, one of the things that I like to do, and I'll show you a few examples here in a second, is um, go to Google Earth and take like a screenshot image of your farm or your pasture area and just start drawing around different ideas. Print off a few copies, give them to some friends, and all draw ideas. They'll probably all be different, right? But you can use those ideas to pull from and start to figure out what might work the best for your farm. Other things to think about, access, of course, to the barn or shelter, easy, in and out of different pastures as needed, movement between fields, whether you're going to be like leading animals to different pastures every day, or you want like laneways with gates you can open and shut, feeding areas, where are they going to be able to access hay if they need it, or is there a dry lot or someplace like that that they are going to be fed hay in? Access to shade or water. So I wanted to show this is kind of a little figure showing obviously we want to maximize the number of pastures that have access to a given watering system, right? So we can minimize the number of watering systems we have to put in. But there is a limit. Oftentimes, a wagon wheel or a pinwheel type shape could potentially give us a lot of pastures accessing one water system. But we start to see this really heavy kind of use area with like degradation of the soil, really heavy overgrazing happening near that watering system, and really underutilization or kind of lack of grazing further out in the end of those pastures. So something to think about. In a perfect world, pastures would be relatively square. The longer and skinnier we make them, the harder it is to overcome this kind of range of overutilization versus underutilization. So I wanted to show just a couple of examples. These are actual farms that I have worked with. This first one is from when I was a grad student in Minnesota, was a farm that we were working with. They had just basically the exterior fencing and no kind of subdivisions inside their paddocks, but were interested in setting up kind of a easy rotational grazing system. So this is kind of an example of a plan that we came up with for them. You can see there's 5 different pastures there that are kind of subdivided that are roughly square or similar in size. They also had like a central dry lot area, which is where they were going to provide their kind of water, shade, hay, mineral, whatever else they needed to provide. And other than the far right paddock, all 4 of those pastures can be easily accessed to and from the dry lot just by opening a gate. So anywhere you see those little dashes, those are the gates, and they have like a laneway leading to the few that are further away. So they could easily open and close a gate and move animals to the next pasture by closing one gate and opening the next gate. So an easy way to kind of make your life easy, not, setting up and taking down a lot of fences, just have to open and close gates to move animals around. That's definitely an option. This is another farm here in Maryland that I was at, I think, last year. And you can see they have those really long, skinny areas, right? In a perfect world, all of our barns and handling facilities would be in the middle of our pastures, right? But it doesn't always work out that way. So in this case, their barn and arena and all those things were on kind of one far end. And you can see in this field the amount of degradation that was happening up here where it was really concentrated versus down here where it was really underutilized and not grazed that much at all. And so they were having this issue of how do we set up a rotational system and kind of minimize the degradation that's happening up closer to those barns. The other complication with this farm was they had different groups of animals that they wanted to keep separately. So in the previous example was just one herd, right? That could be all rotated together across that field. This one, they had a few different ones. So bear with me. This is going to look just a little complicated for a second. But the yellow lines and the yellow X's are the only things we're adding here. Everything else is exactly how it was, right? And so this was just an example that we came up with. They have three dry lot areas. So this one here, and this one over here. And each of those dry lot areas, just by adding some gates and some subdivisions, have, 3 to 6, I think, paddocks going from them. So 1, 2, and 3 go with this dry lot. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 with this little laneway can all go to this dry lot. 9 can be a pasture or could be an extra dry lot if we needed one. This dry lot up here could have access to 8, 10, 11, 12. So you see like where we were going with this, right? We were trying to minimize adding additional fencing and making things overly complicated, but just adding some key gates and fence lines to really help them start to make things a little bit less long and skinny, a little bit more square, and a little bit more subdivided to help kind of even out the utilization in that field. So this is, again, like that 3 to 6 kind of paddocks per each of those dry lots. Gives them multiple dry lots to work with. Just added that one short laneway to kind of get animals out to the far end of that field a little bit more easily, and then some more gates and subdivisions. So again, a million different ways you could set this up. I'm not saying that this is the perfect answer, but it's just something to think about as you're thinking about maybe how to make this work kind of on your farm or in your system. All right, so that wraps up rest. And the last R that I wanted to touch on was something called residual, which may be a term that you might be less familiar with. But basically, residual means that we want to maximize the amount of green leaves that are left in a field and leave an adequate amount of forage after grazing or at the end of grazing. So residual is basically what's left in the field when we move animals out of that field and into the next field. So if we think about residual in terms of plant growth, and we ask ourselves the question of what does a plant need to grow? Essentially, if you think back to your like high school biology class, right? The plants are basically little miniature solar panels, right? They're harvesting that energy from the sun and then using that for plant growth and to produce more forage material. So if we think about them as little solar panels out in the field, there are two places that forages can get energy for regrowth from. The first is what we just said by functioning as little solar panels, right? So leaf area remaining. So only green leaves, right, can actually carry out this photosynthetic process. So if we have, these two plants as examples that are grazed down to different heights, the one on the top has a lot more leaf material removed, right? It was grazed a lot tighter. So we'll have a slower rate of photosynthesis versus the one on the bottom has more leaves left. It's still been grazed off, but less tightly, and it has a much more rapid rate of photosynthesis to produce energy as a result. The other place that plants can get energy from is their stored carbohydrates. And it will vary a little bit depending on the species of forage that we're talking about. But most grasses store a lot of their energy reserves in the stem base. So like orchard grass, tall fescue, brome grass, all of those are storing a lot of their energy reserves in the bottom 3 to 4 inches of the plant. Legumes like alfalfa or red clover will store more of their energy in their taproot, so they have a little bit of an advantage there. But a lot of the grasses are storing a lot of energy in the bottom few inches of their stem. And so, what this means in terms of residual or kind of grazing pressure is that if we're using a lower grazing height, then we're cutting that plant off lower, or grazing it tighter. We're leaving less leaf area to photosynthesize, and we're leaving less of those stored carbohydrates. So, we're depleting both of those energy sources. With a higher grazing height or more of that residual left, we're leaving more leaf area to photosynthesize and we're leaving more of those stored carbohydrates remaining. So hopefully you see where I'm going with this, right? They'll be set up for a lot more success with just a little bit higher of a grazing height, a little bit more of that residual left with that plant. And again, what's happening above the soil surface is also fairly reflective of what's happening below the soil surface. So they actually did some studies years ago looking at different leaf removal amounts and how that affected the root growth. And essentially, they found that there was a direct proportion between the amount of leaf removed and the root growth stoppage. So basically, halting root growth as that plant was trying to recover and rebuild its energy reserves. And so they found that basically removing more than 50% of the leaf material halted root growth. And so over time, if that keeps happening and happening and happening, you can see why some of these plants stop persisting because they're constantly trying to rebuild those energy reserves and eventually they just can't keep up, right? The other thing that the residual does is it will protect the soil surface from erosion and it will also keep the soil surface a lot cooler. So this was a study at University of Kentucky where they were looking at temperature both in the soil and at the crown or the base of the plant. And they were looking at different cutting heights and things, but essentially when they cut those plants down to a 1 inch height, they were much hotter, right? A hotter soil temperature, a hotter crown temperature compared to when they had cut plants to a 4.5 inch height. They were much cooler, cooler soil temperature, cooler crown temperature. And that cool temperature is better for all of the cool season grasses, right? They thrive under that cooler temperature. It's better for the soil microbiology that's going on below the soil surface that we were talking about trying to kind of build and boost. So overall, setting that plant up for a lot more success. And so they've also done studies like it's a little counterintuitive, right? Like, okay, we're leaving more forage in the field. That's wasting it, right? Like, we don't want to waste it. We want to graze everything that's available to us. I understand that, and it makes perfect sense, right? But they actually looked at, well, how does the residual affect the long-term growth? Like, how much this plant produces in a whole year versus just in one kind of grazing bout. And so this study was looking at some different residual heights. Again, if we look at the 2 inch, which was that shorter grazing height, versus a 4 inch, which is that higher grazing height, and we compare how fast those plants regrew after being grazed or cut to those different heights, and we kind of trace these over, essentially what it came down to was that it took the shorter residual height plant 64 days to regrow 1 ton of forage versus it took the higher residual height only 40 days to regrow that same 1 ton of forage. So we're leaving a little bit more material in the field, but it's paying off in terms of regrowth and how fast those plants are growing back, right? So the overgrazing slows the plant growth, which leads to overall a reduction in the seasonal or the long-term production of that plant. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. And then the last thing I want to touch on with residual was, so we've talked about, health of the soil biology, keeping the soil cool, minimizing erosion, benefits in terms of like the total production, but also over multiple years, what happens, right? And so these are two studies that were looking at the persistence or the percent ground cover of forages over time. So we know like we tend to like lose plants slowly over time, right? And we want to keep every plant we can alive so we don't have to go through and reseed or renovate or, do things like that. So this study was in Wisconsin. They looked at meadow fescue, tall fescue, and orchard grass, again at the 2 versus 4 inch residual height. And you can see very easily that for all of them, the 4 inch residual had a much higher persistence or kind of longevity of those plants over the long run. And this is kind of what that looked like visually. You can see the 2 inch one, we're starting to see a little bit more bare soil, more open areas, versus the 4 inch one still looks a lot thicker. They did a similar study in Kentucky, so a little bit hotter climate than this first study was in Wisconsin. And this one was just looking at orchard grass at some different cutting heights. So you can see again, if we compare the 2 inch cutting height versus the 4 inch cutting height, we're at what, 50% persistence maybe with the 2 inch cutting height versus like 95 to 100% persistence with the 4 inch cutting height. So a lot of advantages in the long term by leaving just that little bit of extra material in the field to begin with. All right, so that kind of wraps up the 4 R's, if you will, kind of our 4 R's for grazing management. That healthy root system, using rotation, that allows us to provide plants with rest, not grazing things down too tightly, leaving that adequate residual. Um, One thing that often comes up when I've talked about this is, well, what about like weed encroachment or weed management, right? Like that's not part of this picture, right? When it comes to weed control, we know that we have, a variety of different things we can call weeds. Most often it's referred to as like a plant out of place, right? Or a plant that we don't want in that system. A corn plant in a soybean field would be a weed, right? Essentially. And these weeds are undesirable because often they're either toxic or they have spines or spikes or whatever that can be irritating to animals. And so animals are not going to graze them, but the weeds are taking light and moisture and space and nutrients from the soil from what could be a desirable plant, right? So we do want to keep an eye on weeds. The reason I did not include it in our kind of list of 4 R's, if you will, is the number one way to control weeds is by using those 4 R's, right? A good, healthy stand of competitive forages is going to outcompete a really large number of weeds. So if we're leaving that good leaf material, if we're using our rest and our rotation and following those good grazing management practices, we're going to eliminate the opportunity for a lot of those weeds to come in and find a foothold and start to fill in. So I didn't leave it off the list because it's not something to worry about. But by maintaining that healthy forage stand and using those practices, we're hopefully going to outcompete the weeds from the get-go. So if we do need to do some weed management, there are a lot of different options. We have things like cultural control, so selecting species that work well in our forage systems, maintaining that soil fertility, so we're setting our desirable plants up for success. We can use mechanical control, so mowing or clipping to suppress seed production, especially if we have weeds that are trying to go to seed and we want to eliminate that kind of seed production. We have biological control. There are a lot of weeds actually that animals will eat. Horses are kind of on the low end of selectivity or high end of selectivity, so they don't tend to eat a lot of the weedier or more forb type species. But if you have other animals like small ruminants especially, or horses will eat some forb or weed type species. And then, of course, we do have chemical control or herbicides as a tool in our toolbox. I just wanted to mention that the selection of what herbicide to use and the timing of when to spray that herbicide is going to depend on what weeds you have present in your field. So we'll pick different herbicides to target different weeds, and it depends what weed it is, but also its growth stage. Those are two really important things that we need to think about if we're going to be using herbicides for chemical control, but that is a tool that we have in our toolbox. Um, so we need to know kind of the life stage of these different weeds. We have, winter annuals that basically germinate in the fall, overwinter, and then go to seed in the spring or early summer. So the best time to control is late fall or early spring. We have summer annuals, which germinate in the spring and go to seed in the late summer or fall. So we want to control those in the spring or early summer when they're still small. For both of the annual species, we basically want to target them when they're still small. When they're really little, that's when we'll have our best success at controlling them. Perennials can be a little bit trickier to control because they don't go by that annual life cycle. But we want to hit those either in kind of the late spring when they're like have started to get a little bit bigger and they're in kind of a bud stage, or in the fall because a lot of those perennials at that point are translocating energy down to their root system to be able to survive the winter. And so if we hit them with an herbicide then they will translocate that herbicide down as well, and that can be a better control from that. So just some things to think about when it comes to weed management. So with that, I think I'm going to skip this section really quick just because I know we're kind of like running out of time. If someone has questions, we can come back to it. Um, but I wanted to kind of wrap up by saying a couple things. So um, there is no one size fits all system. Hopefully you've seen from a few of the different examples on here that there are lots of ways to accomplish good grazing management. So I always encourage people like start small, stay flexible. Like it takes time to figure out what's going to work best for you and for your farm. Focus again on these kind of good grazing management practices that will get you a long way in terms of kind of boosting pasture productivity. And then I kind of wanted to conclude with this example. So people always say, well, I don't have enough pasture to make these practices work, right? Like I just don't have enough space. It's never going to work for me. So this is an example. This is a horse operation that has just a miniature horse, and they only have zero point 0.7 acres of pasture. This was a farm down in North Carolina. I borrowed this example from a colleague down there. So this entire pasture system is zero point 0.7 acres. You can basically see the entire thing from this picture. And you can actually see the little miniature horse grazing here under his little shade structure or resting under his shade structure maybe. And basically they subdivided this field into different sections to kind of follow this, good grazing management. You can see this is where he just grazed here in this strip to the right. This is where he is now, obviously, and this is like the green grass ahead of him as he works his way across this field. And this farm essentially was able to, rotate this little horse across this zero point 0.7 acre field. And because of this good grazing management practices, they were able to graze the whole year and not have to feed any hay. So you can do a lot and you can boost your production a lot no matter your size, right? If you're a small farm, if you're a medium farm, if you're a really large farm, all of these principles are going to work and just be scaled up or down accordingly. So hopefully that provides you a little bit of encouragement. I did want to put my contact information up here. I'm happy to like answer questions if anyone has questions or follow up. I know I've kind of packed a lot into 1 hour, and I'm sure there are questions and other things to follow up on. So um, I'm happy to answer questions now, and also feel free to reach out if you have other questions.
Awesome. I guess we'll open it up for questions. Go ahead, Raul.
Thank you very much for that talk. Very informative. Um, I had a question, and it's funny that this presentation was right now because we were just talking about spraying herbicides and trying to fertilize. My question was, we typically spray like Grazon this time of year.
Mhm.
Is it better to fertilize first and then spray Grazon when those weeds are kind of in the early phase of growth versus as a pre-emergent? Or is it better to spray the Grazon first and then fertilize later?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say it depends a little bit on your circumstances, obviously, and what weeds you would be spraying. But for the most part, we want the fertilizer to be used by our desirable species. So I would suggest spraying first, eliminating the weeds that are there, And then that way, hopefully, the fertilizer will go towards the desirable species that we want to be putting growth on. Most of the time, if the weeds are there, even if they're small, they're usually big enough to take up the herbicide. So there's not usually a lot of trouble with that. So that would be my recommendation would be spray first and then fertilize after that.
Okay, great. And then is Grazon like one of the more preferred herbicides for um, livestock grazing, or is there something that's better general treatment of weeds? I think we have a little bit of everything, but mainly those summer weeds based off your chart, I think.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Grazon, I'm actually looking up real quick because I learn everything based on the active ingredients and not the trade names. So they like differ a little bit. And if I'm remembering right, Grazon is Picloram. Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good broad spectrum herbicide that will cover kind of a lot of different varieties. It's a combination one that has two different active ingredients in it. So yeah, that's a very common one. Most of our kind of broad spectrum herbicides that hit a lot of our target weeds in pasture systems will contain a combination of dicamba, 2,4-D, some of those kind of really common active ingredients. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, I have a question. What are some of the diverse plants you would recommend besides just clover in the pasture? Because I know we talked about the grasses and everything. What would be another um, diverse plant you would recommend planting in pastures?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, I stopped sharing so I can actually see people or see what's happening in the screen here. Yeah, so to build diversity in a pasture system, clovers are very common, right? Like red and white clover. That's one of the most common ones. Alfalfa is not as often used in pasture systems, but definitely can be. It can be kind of incorporated into pasture mixes. Other ones that are becoming common are some of the forb species. So they're not technically a legume, like they don't have the nitrogen fixing properties, but they're what we would call a forb, which is kind of like a general term for another type of broadleaf plant. Those would be like chicory. I'm seeing more and more in pasture mixes. We have some of that in our pasture mix at the research center. There's bird's-foot trefoil is another legume that can be in pasture mixes. Since I know where you are, I'm going to say that one probably isn't going to work for you because that one usually does better in like more cooler, kind of further north than where we are here in Maryland, except if you're in the mountains, maybe. Um, there are people who are using like plantain and dandelion and some of those ones that kind of are naturally, we don't often have to like, go out and plant them. A lot of times they're out there. Normally, there are like 100 or more different species of clover too. So if there are, certain types of clover or certain, characteristics that people are looking for, there's often a lot of different clover species that can be used for that. Those are some of the big ones, I think. There's also a lot of interest in using more like the cover crop annual forage species, but those would be like on an annual basis. Like you have to reestablish them every year. They're not necessarily a perennial. So,
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
yep.
Anyone else? Great. Well, it looks like you covered
Hey, I got
everything.
one.
There you go.
This was great. We've been talking and trying to figure out what we want to do with our pastures. So I'm in Maryland. Should I just take a soil sample to my like local ag, or should I try to find where you are?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question. I should have said also like for anyone, even if you're in even if you're not in Maryland, like feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to like connect you to whoever the local people are in your area. I can help you find them if you're not able to. But for those of you in Maryland, yeah, I'm kind of across the state, hopping around and working a lot with our different county agriculture agents. So, where in Maryland are you? What part?
I'm over in Chestertown, so
Chestertown.
over
Okay.
on the eastern shore.
Yep, yep. So, a couple options. One is I can connect you to some of the ag agents over there if you want help or you want to like borrow a soil probe or whatever. They're happy to help with that. Two, some you can purchase your own soil probe if that's something you're going to be kind of, looking to do a little bit more often. They're not very expensive. I think 100, maybe 200-ish at the most. And then as far as where the samples go, University of Maryland unfortunately does not have a soil testing lab at the university. They used to years ago, and for whatever reason, they got rid of it. So one of the labs that is some of the labs that are fairly common around us, Delaware still has a soil lab, so people will send samples over there. Pennsylvania has a forage lab, so people might send samples up there. For commercial labs, we have Spectrum Analytical, which is in Ohio. It's not too far away. That's where we send most of our soil samples to. So lots of different options kind of in the area.
Sweet, thanks.
Yep. And soil samples are pretty cheap too. They're maybe 15, probably 20 at the most. So it's a very affordable way to kind of figure out what's going on in your pasture system.
I actually had one more question as you're going.
Yeah.
Do you have, so I know there's usually recommendations of how many horses should be on what acreage, or is there any formula or guidance on, I saw the little mini pony on that point 0.7
Yeah.
acre, but do you have a recommendation of, okay, if you have, I don't know, two horses, your square should be no less
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
this. Is there a formula?
Yeah, so for the Midwest, Southeast, Eastern US, where we have a lot of cool season forages and higher rainfall environments, so not like out west where they don't get as much rain. The general rule of thumb is usually about 2 acres per animal unit or per horse, if you're looking to provide like the bulk of their forage intake from pasture. Now, if they're only out for 4 hours a day and they're getting a lot of pasture from, or forage from hay or other sources, you can play around with those. But in general, we usually recommend around 2 acres per horse to provide like kind of the full forage that they'll need during the growing season. That is very variable depending on the productivity of your field and what's growing in the field and the rainfall that year and all of those things. But that kind of gives you like a rough place to start. In contrast, like out west where they're in really arid environments and they don't get a lot of rainfall, they're going to be looking at 10, 20, 30, even higher acres per animal to sustain their forage needs. So it really depends a lot on where you are. But yeah, for our region, kind of that 2 acre per horse is a good place to start.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. If there are no other questions, thank you everyone for coming. And I will post the recording on YouTube for everybody to see. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.